Today we're going to begin looking at what happens in between the Old Testament and the New Testament. Some of it has to do with the Roman Republic. Some of it has to do with the remains of the Greek Empire. Much of it has to do with Israel. And so it's kind of a bringing together several of the different civilizations that we have studied, kind of bringing it all together here in one spot. And the guideline for this is going to be the prophecy that Daniel gives in Daniel chapter 11 about what would happen. And what we're going to do is, you having read Daniel 11, you are a little bit familiar with it, but probably didn't understand a lot of what was going on. He's talking about what's going to happen in the future, and we're going to look at what he said and then see what actually happened that fulfilled what he said. Which, even though we shouldn't be, I guess, amazed that anything that God says that will happen comes true, but it is amazing how it actually works out. And I think you'll find it very interesting and maybe somewhat confusing. Hopefully, we'll be able to straighten out some of those confusing things. Now, what I'm going to give you is, as far as I know, something very unique. I've never seen this anywhere before. And that is a side-by-side comparison with Daniel 11 and then beside it what actually happened. As far as I know, no one's ever done this. So you have something that is something that no one else has, as far as I know. So we're going to follow along today. There's nothing for you to fill out this time, but I would suggest that we highlight as we go some of the important things. So if you have a highlighter, get that out. If you don't, borrow one or go get one. I said to go get one. Now, if you're at home, I would suggest getting a copy of this prior to listening to the lecture. I think it will help greatly, although I will have much of what we're doing on the screen. It will be easier with this copy. To begin, to give kind of an overview of where we are, looking at the history of Israel, and we're looking specifically at the intertestamental period, which means between the Old Testament and New Testament. Does anybody know how long that period lasted between the Old Testament and New Testament? Take a stab. A couple weeks? 100 years? You're going to say 100 years also? 400. Several people? 400? 250. Actually, Matthew hits it right on the nose. And okay, I thought maybe it said it on there. 400 years.
Oh, this is the wrong room. Sorry.
Think about what happened 400 years ago. What year would that be? You guys are not math wizards, I take it. 1618, right? Now, does anybody know what happened just after 1618? Maybe like 1620? Massachusetts? Plymouth Rock, ring a bell? None of you have ever heard of Plymouth Rock? Have you ever heard of a ship called the Mayflower?
Yeah.
It landed at Plymouth Rock in 1620 when the Pilgrims first arrived. Does that seem like a long time ago from here? Yeah. So for the Jewish people, for Israel, 400 years is a very long time to not hear anything from God. No prophets. But that doesn't mean nothing happened in those 400 years. There was stuff that happened. And some of it is information that becomes very interesting in our understanding of the New Testament. Some of it will have some things to do, to influence that occur in the Gospels. So it's important for us to understand these things, even to study the Bible, even though nothing's happening in the Bible during those years. All right, so we have these silent years. The last prophet of the Old Testament is Malachi. 400 years, and then we have John the Baptist, who's also an Old Testament prophet. Jesus says he's a prophet. And then we have the New Testament era beginning with Christ. When we look at the intertestamental period, we see that it begins with domination by the Persians, and then domination by the Greeks. The Jewish state will be born from the Maccabean revolt, will be independent for a while, and then eventually they'll fall under the vassalship and subjection by the Romans. So we're going to see these people come into play. Now, we've already dealt with the Persians. We're probably not going to say anything more about them, but we'll go on to the Greeks, the independents, and the Romans. So we begin our saga with understanding Alexander's empire, the Greeks. You remember that Alexander conquered the known world in a very short period of time, but he died at a very young age before he had a chance to even think about having a successor. And so what happened to his empire? It was divided up according to his generals. And how many generals? 4 generals. And we saw that reflected in the 4-headed beast, the 4-headed animal that Daniel prophesied as well. All right, so these are the 2 major generals that we're concerned about, especially as it relates to Israel. And that is Seleucid, and his family is called the Seleucids, and then the family named after Ptolemy, called the Ptolemies. The Ptolemies are down in Egypt. The Seleucids are up here, Asia Minor and Syria, and over this way some too. But what's in between the Seleucids and the Ptolemies? What land is in between them that you know of? Israel. So any conflict between the two is going to involve Israel. And that's a large part of what we're going to be seeing here. All right, we consider the Ptolemies. Here's their family tree. We won't go into detail here, but just to get an idea, we have Ptolemy and Bernice. And we see lots of Ptolemies. Ptolemy the second, the third. We see several Bernices. There's Ptolemy the 4th, 5th, 6th. Ptolemy the 6th marries Cleopatra the 2nd. Has Ptolemy the 7th. There's a Cleopatra the 3rd. And then we keep going on all these down. All these different Ptolemies. They just can't come up with another name. So they keep it in the family. Eventually we get down here to Ptolemy the 14th. And Ptolemy the 15th. These Ptolemies are the brothers of Cleopatra the 7th, which is the Cleopatra that you know. You know she was the 7th one, did you? She eventually has sexual relations with Julius Caesar and has Ptolemy the 15th, it says here. I'm not sure what that number is. She also has relations with Marcus Antonius, it says here, Mark Antony, and has 3 children, 2 of them twins. All right, so that's the family of the Ptolemies in Egypt. All right, now we're going to compare that family. We're going to go through some of it. We're going to get down to Ptolemy the 6th here. And here's the Seleucid family as they go along. And we're going to see that there are times when there's some intermarriage taking place here. And we'll talk about that and see what relationships that brings about and what problems that brings about. All right, now, if you look on your paper, you will see as we begin in Daniel 11:1 on the left-hand side, and on the right-hand side is what happens in history. All right, so Daniel 11:1. Would someone read verses 1 and 2 for us? Noah?
And in the first year of Darius the Mede, I rose to be an encouragement and a protection for him. And now I will tell you the truth. Behold, 3 more kings are going to arise in Persia, then a 4th will gain more riches than all of them. As soon as he becomes strong through his riches, he will rouse the whole empire against the realm of Greece.
All right, so this is the prophecy that Daniel gives. 3 more kings are going to come after Darius the Mede. And we see in the history, those 3 kings were Cambyses, Smerdis, Darius Hystaspes, and Xerxes. We talked about that before when we were looking at the Persian Empire, remember? Xerxes is the one that became wealthy, and he's the one that invaded Greece. Do you remember who was it that he married? Esther, yes, he married Esther. And he invaded Greece, as it says there, to avenge the loss of Darius the Great, but he was defeated at Athens at the Battle of Salamis. All right, so that's essentially fulfilling what's in verses 1 and 2. Now let's go to verse 3. John?
And a mighty king will arise, and he will rule with great authority and do as he pleases.
Okay, to whom might that be referring? Well, that's talking about Alexander the Great. And we know that Alexander crossed the Hellespont over into Asia Minor, and he brought an end to the Persian Empire and brought further expansion of the Greek Empire with the destruction of Tyre. Remember the ingenious way that he did that? The sparing of Jerusalem. Remember how the high priest came out and showed in the scriptures, and he spared Jerusalem. The capture of Egypt, and he established a city there named after himself, Alexandria, and then an invasion of India, all the way over into India. But then we see in 323, Alexander the Great died. And he, it says here, the infant son of Alexander the Great was Alexander IV, born of the Persian princess Roxana. Kept under Cassandra's custody, he was removed by murder in 310 BC. His uncle, Philip, who was an illegitimate brother of Alexander III and mentally deranged, had already been assassinated. Thus, there were no descendants or blood relatives to succeed Alexander himself, and the prediction not go to his descendants found fulfillment. All right, let's see where that prediction is over in verse 4. Would somebody read 4? Griff.
But as soon as he has arisen, his kingdom will be broken up and parceled out with the 4 points of the compass.
Hi. I'm sorry. I'm supposed to tell Amelia that she cannot forget your chicken nuggets. Sorry.
This is yours.
Okay.
This is what we're covering right now. So, hi Maya. You'll be watching this and following along at home.
Thank you.
Did you finish?
No.
Go ahead.
Not to his own descendants, nor according to his authority which he granted. For his sovereignty will be uprooted and given to others beside him.
All right, so notice that part about that his kingdom will not be given to his own descendants. And that's what happened. So we look over on the right again, we see that the empire was instead divided among his 4 generals, which we're told would happen back in Daniel 11:4. So we have Ptolemy Soter ruling Egypt and Palestine. We have Seleucus Nicator over Syria and Mesopotamia. Antipater and his son Cassander took Greece and Macedonia, and Lysimachus ruled Asia Minor. So those are things that we have already talked about before. All right, now we continue in verse 5, and that basically sets the background. Although Daniel is prophesying what would happen, but now we get into the real story here. So we go to verse 5. Would someone read that? Stephen?
Then the king of the south will grow strong, along with one of his princes, who will gain ascendancy over him and obtain dominion. His dominion will be a great dominion indeed.
All right, so the king of the south would be which? Which of these Greek generals would be the king of the south? Ptolemy, because Egypt is south of everything else, right? And especially south of Israel. So we would expect to find that the prophecies will be fulfilled through Ptolemy, and it says he'll gain ascendancy over one of the princes. All right, let's find out what that's talking about. Over on the right, in the year 310, the king of the south was Ptolemy Soter. And let's see, maybe it's back on this one. Here's Ptolemy Soter right here. It talks about what he does. So you can look down through here if you like while you're looking at your page. So we want to highlight Ptolemy the first there, Ptolemy Soter. And it's too bad I couldn't give you this in color because I have it color coded so that everything on your left, the scripture, is color coded with whatever matches on the right. But unfortunately, couldn't print it that way. But you may be able to tell from the highlighting what goes with what. And you can even draw arrows if that helps you to match them up. All right, so Ptolemy the First, his ambitions extended far beyond the borders of Egypt, where he'd been placed in charge, to Palestine and the rest of Asia. So he wanted to conquer more. Temporarily, his naval forces captured Cyprus and important bases in Asia Minor. So from down here in Egypt, he captures Cyprus, and then he also wants to capture these places in Asia Minor. That means that he is going against his fellow general and his family, the Seleucids. Notice what it says next. The prince who gained ascendancy was Seleucus Nicator of the Seleucid Empire. So here we have Seleucus Nicator, and he gains ascendancy. In other words, he's gaining more power at the same time that Ptolemy is also trying to expand into his territory. He was given authority to rule in Babylon, we're told here in 321. But in 316, Babylon came under attack by another general, and Seleucus sought to get help from Ptolemy I. So Seleucid needs help, so he calls on Ptolemy to assist him. That's essentially what's happening here. And Seleucid was able to be successful. And so he returned to Babylon, greatly strengthened. You know, he's gaining ascendancy. He was well liked in Babylon, and with Ptolemy's help, 2 years after which he assumed the title of king, so that in 310 became the official starting date for the Seleucid era. He ruled over Babylon, Media, and Syria, and assumed the title of king. Since the Seleucids controlled all of Alexander the Great's old domains from the east all the way over to India and to the west to Syria and Phoenicia, his authority far surpassed that of his sponsor, that is the one who was helping him, Ptolemy I. So Ptolemy I, remember, he's expanded from Egypt up this direction and up into Asia Minor. Meanwhile, Seleucus has expanded this direction over into Babylon, and so they're both gaining more and more power. But remember, Seleucus started out by getting help from Ptolemy. Well, now he's gotten more power than Ptolemy. He's gotten bigger than Ptolemy. So what happens next? Well, that brings them to battle. Look at the next paragraph. The families of Ptolemy I and Seleucus fought. But later, their two countries entered into an alliance. Ptolemy I dies, which brings Ptolemy II to the throne. So he ruled in Egypt. Meanwhile, Seleucus was murdered, and his son Antiochus I came to power. So now we got the two sons that are ruling. Then Seleucus' grandson, Antiochus II, ruled in Syria following the death of his father. Well, when we get down to 250, so in this area right here, the Egyptian Jews had been there so long by the reign of Ptolemy II of Philadelphus that they no longer wrote or spoke Hebrew. What's the problem with that? They can't read God's Word. So that becomes an issue. So what do? Well, it just so happened that there was a spur for them to do something about it that came about because of the Egyptian historian Manetho, who wrote a history of Egypt. And if you're writing a history of ancient Egypt, you've got to include the Exodus, right? That's a big deal when millions of people suddenly leave your country. So Manetho dealt with it. But what did he say? He said that the Jews had been expelled from Egypt because they had leprosy. Is that true? No. Would that be offensive to the Jewish people that were living in Egypt at the time? Might that affect how the people of Egypt treated the Jews living there at that time? Oh yeah, you're the descendants of those lepers we kicked out. Yeah, so it's not a good thing. So the Jewish people decide we need to do something about this to correct this misinformation. And they also wanted to distinguish themselves from the Palestinian Jews, the Jews living up in Israel. And they also wanted to impress the Egyptians with how old the Jewish race was and how old their law was. You know, these are not just people that came upon the scene recently and we suddenly come up with a law. So they wanted the Egyptian people to respect them, basically. And in addition, they wanted to be able to read their own scriptures. So they consented to create a Greek translation of the Hebrew text of scriptures. And does everybody remember what that's called? The Greek translation of the Old Testament scriptures? It's called the Septuagint, which comes from the word for 70, and it's abbreviated with the Roman numerals LXX, which is the number 70. Why 70? Because of the tradition that 70 or 72 Jewish scholars worked on the translation. So because of that, it has come to be called Septuagint. Now, it was translated entirely by Jews living in Egypt, not Jews living in Palestine or Israel. And sometimes that affects the translation. In other words, sometimes there are places in the Septuagint that indicate that the people translating did not know some of the names of places. And so, you know how we have names of cities that maybe have a meaning. So let's say Philadelphia. If you are writing that you're going to Philadelphia, you would say, I'm going to Philadelphia. Well, what if you were translating somebody saying that and didn't know that Philadelphia was a name? Does anybody know the meaning of Philadelphia? City of brotherly love. You ever heard that? Well, if you didn't know that was in a city, you might translate, I'm going to the city of brotherly love. Well, that may not mean exactly the same thing. You may think that that's just a city that's, has a lot of loving people in it. Well, it's really the proper name. So things like that happen in the Septuagint, which indicates that the Jews of Palestine didn't have anything to do with it. And in fact, as you look here, you'll see that Palestinian Jews would not have had anything to do with it. They would have considered putting God's word into Greek as an affront against God, because God gave it to them in Hebrew, and to put it in another language would be wrong, just wrong. And as I said, it places the, I didn't say this, no. Secondly, it places the Septuagint departs from the Hebrew text, the Masoretic text. So, they say something different than what's in the Hebrew text. And thirdly, this is what I was talking about, at times there's an imperfect knowledge of Hebrew and an inaccurate knowledge of places in Palestine. So this was purely an Egyptian Jewish work. But it's important for us because it does help us to understand some things in the Old Testament, maybe a little bit better sometimes, and it helps us to understand some things in the New Testament, because often the New Testament writers, because they're writing in Greek, quote from the Septuagint instead of from the Hebrew Bible, from the Hebrew Old Testament. So, that's an important thing that happens here in Egypt during this time. They only translated initially the Pentateuch and the book of Joshua, but they finished the rest by 131 BC. So they started around 250 and to 131. So it took a while to get the rest of the Old Testament translated. Now, just as an aside, as you note here, at the same time that this is occurring, the First Punic War is occurring between Carthage and Rome. So you can see we've backed up a little bit chronologically to be where we are here, and we'll proceed forward. All right, so looking back at these guys, and Ptolemy II and Antiochus II were bitter enemies. But finally, after some years, they entered into an alliance in about 250. So let's read verse 6 and see what happens prophetically, what was supposed to happen. Somebody read verse 6. Zach.
And after some years they will form an alliance. And the daughter of the king of the south will come to the king of the north, carry out peaceful arrangement.
All right, so what happened? Well, to seal the alliance between the two, Ptolemy II here sends his daughter Bernice to be married to Antiochus II. Let's see if I have. So Ptolemy II has a daughter, that indicates his daughter Bernice, and she comes over here and marries Antiochus II. All right, so that, you know, and that in the ancient world, that's how they made treaties, right? You married somebody, and that was supposed to keep you from attacking the other person. All right, but that's not the end of it. There's a complication. Do you notice the M means married? See? Do you notice anything here that might be a problem?
He already has a wife.
He already has a wife because he already had married Laodice, or Laodice. I'm not sure how you pronounce that. We'll call her Laodice. And she was a very powerful and influential woman. Now, he does this to have a treaty with the Ptolemies, but he's already married, and that's an issue. Oh, by the way, not only is she his wife, she's also his half-sister. So he's marrying outside the family here. And she didn't take very kindly to being divorced. Despite the obvious political advantages accruing from an alliance with Ptolemaic Egypt. So she organized a successful conspiracy operating from the place where she had been banished and where she had been sent after he divorced her. So let's look at what the prophecy is over here, continuing in verse 6, right to the left of where we're looking. Who will read that?
For she will not retain her position of power, nor will he remain with his power. But she will be given up along with those who brought her in.
All right, so what's it saying? That the daughter of the king of the south, who came up and married the king of the north, would not retain that position of power. And so she's going to be given up. All right, what happened? Well, if you look on the right, you see. The marriage to Bernice did not last. When Ptolemy II died, Antiochus II thought, well, this isn't working out. I don't think it'll matter to Ptolemy III that I'm married to his sister, and so he was having lots of trouble with Laodice, so he gets rid of Bernice. He divorces Bernice and remarried his former wife, Laodice. So, would that make her happy? Let's see. Laodice still bore a grudge, even though she's back in as wife. And so she had Bernice and her infant son murdered. That's what it means when it says that she will be given up. It means that she'll be given up to death, to be murdered. Not long afterward, the king Antiochus II was poisoned to death. Wonder how that happened. We don't know for sure, but what might you think? Who do you think might have had something to do with that? Who could it be? I wonder. Well, do you have an idea? Well, the party backing Laodice then engineered a coup d'etat that put her in power as the queen regent while her son, Seleucus II, was still too young to rule. So she's ruling in place of her son until he gets old enough. And so in this manner, the prophecy was fulfilled concerning Bernice, that she would be handed over along with the nobles who supported her in Antioch. All right, now let's go back to the last part of verse 6 there, across there on the left. And do you want to continue reading there?
And the one who desired her as well as he who supported her in those times.
All right, so those people are dealt with. We see over in verse over on the right side in 246, verse 7 sets forth then the subsequent reprisal. So Ptolemy III is not going to let this go. His sister's just been murdered. So is he going to do something about it? Well, let's see. Read verse 7 for us. Somebody else want to read now? Verse 7. John.
But one of the descendants of her line will rise in his place, and he will come against their army and enter the fortress of the king of the north, and he will deal with them and display great strength.
All right, sounds like a descendant of her line, someone in the south, is going to rise up and invade the fortress of the king of the north and have a lot of strength. Okay, what happens? Over on the right-hand side, we see the reprisal. Ptolemy Philadelphus died, we have here, in 247, soon after the tragedy that had overtaken his daughter Bernice. His capable son, Ptolemy III, down here, organized a great expeditionary force against Syria in order to avenge his sister's death. So Bernice is killed, is murdered, so Ptolemy III says, well, we're going to invade. This war raged from 246 to 241. And during that war, Ptolemy captured and pillaged the Seleucid capital of Antioch and revenged his sister's death by executing Laodice. So she got her just reward, didn't she? And then he invaded the eastern domains as far as Bactria, which is over towards India. Seleucus II, remember he was too young to rule. He was able to hide out in Asia Minor and escaped. Right? And then Ptolemy III goes on to shatter the Seleucid navy in the Aegean Sea up near Greece, and remained the foremost naval power in that region for the duration of his reign. He succeeded on other fronts as well, for he reunited the western end of Libya and Africa with the Ptolemaic domains after it had enjoyed 12 years of independence. So he recaptured Libya. He also recovered all his father's conquests on the coast of Asia Minor and temporarily gained control of some portions of Thrace. So he's increasing the power even more. So he's gone this way with his power over to Libya, and he's captured areas in Asia Minor, even up into Thrace. So Ptolemy III has increased his power more and more, and part of that at the expense of the Seleucids. Now let's look at verse 8. Someone read verse 8 for us.
Section. And also their gods with their metal images and their precious vessels of silver and gold, he will take into captivity to Egypt.
All right, now this was probably totally obscure to you. What in the world is that talking about? Look at what happened. Ptolemy III, in invading the Seleucid territory, went all the way over to Babylon. and recovered the long-lost idols and sacred treasures from Persia that were taken by Cambyses. Remember Cambyses, the Persian emperor? Remember he had gone down into Egypt and had conquered Egypt and Libya. And remember when he was on his way back because he heard that his dead brother had come back and taken over the throne. Remember that? And he died on the way, committed suicide on the way. Well, Cambyses had taken a lot of things from Egypt. And so what Ptolemy III does is he gets this stuff, since he's conquered the Seleucids, he gets the stuff that was there that Cambyses had taken and brings it back to Egypt. So he returns to Egypt with 40,000 talents of silver, 2,500 precious vessels. And because he brought all this stuff back, the Egyptians perceive that he is a hero. You know, before he's somebody who's ruling over them. He's a Greek ruling over the Egyptians. But now he brought back all their stuff, all their idols, all the precious stuff. And so now they are really pleased with him. And it was for this restoration of their national honor as against the hated Persians that they acclaimed him your Getes, benefactor. That's where this name comes from, the fact that he it brings them good stuff. The word "your" there is good. Ptolemy III, and he is given all kinds of accolades from the Egyptian people. He's very popular with them. Now, notice the next thing in verse 8. He, on his part, will refrain from attacking the king of the north for some years. So he made a treaty of peace with Seleucus the second. It says, okay, I've had enough. I'm not going to attack you anymore. And he was occupied with all the other conquests, and so he left Seleucus alone and the Seleucids. So at this point now that we've come to, there's relative peace between the Ptolemies and the Seleucids, but the Ptolemy III has gained great power. He's really powerful in the world at this time. And we'll resume the story on Monday. Any questions?